pubs are closing at a rate of 4 a week across the South East. Campaigners say the big breweries are making life impossible for publicans to earn a decent wage and provide beer at reasonable prices. Nearly half of all pubs are tied into contracts with the big pub companies who control their rents and the prices of the drinks they sell. The government's consulting on the relationship between the pubs and their brewery owners, but do they need to step in and take action? Lucinda Adams reports.
The Great British Pub. The pub industry is worth £3 billion a year to the South East economy and directly employs nearly 90,000 people, making our region more dependent than any other on its success. We have one of the highest concentrations of pubs in the country, but 4 are closing every week. It's a problem made worse, say campaigners, because nearly half of all pubs are run by tenant licensees. They say in many cases large pub companies are charging them inflated rents and drink prices, and without government regulation, they've got them over a barrel.
It's simply unfair, and they've had it their way for too long, and that's one of the main reasons why we're losing so many pubs.
A tied pub is supposed to mean a tenant pays a lower rent in exchange for buying beer from the pub company for a slightly higher than normal price. But publican Tony Leonard says it doesn't always work like that. He now owns the Snowdrop Inn in Lewes with his partner Dominic, but they used to be licensees of 2 tied pubs in Brighton. They got into difficulty after the rent more than tripled in 11 years to £79,000.
At the worst point between the 2 pubs, we were turning over £1.25 million, and we were losing a huge amount of money on that. It was completely unsustainable.
And why was that?
Because of the high rents, because of, in addition to the tied beer prices. I'd also say that the beer selection was the same as everyone else, so we were being undercut. The pub across the road was on a rent of around £30,000 and was completely free of tie.
Tony says he's campaigning because it's too risky for tied tenants to speak out against pub companies. In a free house like this, Tony can buy his drinks directly from suppliers and stock any range of beers he wants. But in a tied house, licensees have to buy their drinks through the pub company. Now, licensees say that limits them to a small range, and that the companies can charge up to twice the market rate for a barrel of beer. Landlords say that's exploitative and stops them running a competitive business. Pub companies say they've developed a voluntary code of practice in the past 3 years and things are improving. But campaigners say change isn't happening fast enough.
We're trying to save the British pub, ladies and gentlemen. The average publican like me earns less than a minimum average wage, and the pub companies are taking a huge slice of our profits.
This week they took their fight to Westminster. The government's proposing a new legal code of conduct for pub companies and a new adjudicator to impose fines if rules are broken. But campaigners want tenants to have the option to rent a pub at market rate without being tied into buying drinks from its owners.
The large pub companies have abused their power and their market dominance, and indeed in many cases have, I'm afraid, bullied their licensees. So we know they can't reform themselves. We know they are so indebted that a lot of the money they're extracting from our local pubs is actually going to pay their creditors. It's a disaster for the UK economy as well as for licensees and for local pubs. The question is, will the new statutory code include the measure that will stop the overcharging? The only one that will is the market rent only option.
Politicians have promised reforms like these before, but they've always bottled out and allowed the industry to self-regulate. Some critics say they fear the power and wealth of the pub companies to lobby politicians. At least 2 companies have already threatened to sue the government over its proposals.
I know obviously lobbying generally is in the news at the moment, and there's very good arguments for having lobbying reform more generally, so that there's transparency of what goes on. I mean, I've certainly met with pub companies just like I've met with licensees, but there shouldn't be any undue power or undue influence that takes place, and I can certainly give you an assurance that I will listen to all of the views and look at the evidence when it comes to deciding on the next steps that we take.
Will the government have to force the issue, or will the pub companies finally change their relationship with licensees? And if new regulations are introduced, Will pub companies comply before more pubs in the southeast have to call last orders?
Lucinda Adams reporting, or joining us from our Millbank studio is the Chief Executive of the British Beer and Pub Association, Brigid Simmonds. Now, from outside your industry, it's hard to see the Tide model system as anything other than fundamentally very unfair.
The Tide model system is a great system of running your own business for a very small amount of capital. In the interview that you had, you talked about somebody who has a free house. You probably need £250,000 upwards to own your own pub. You can actually run your own pub, whether it's tied to a pub company, to a brewery, for as little as £30,000, which is why it's a great system.
It's great. I'll just pick you up on that, because I don't think the Tide landlords would agree that it's great when 60% of them, according to figures out this week, earn less than the minimum wage, £10,000.
Well, we've asked for the details. In fact, the big companies who I represent clearly do not recognise those sorts of figures, and until we see the detail, I mean, we're talking about a small business. You can't compare that with a gross salary. But at the end of the day, the Tide system allows breweries in this country to exist. It's unique. They're not all owned by pub companies. Some of them are owned by breweries. Take Fuller's, take Harvey's, just to name a couple in the southeast. It's absolutely essential that they have a way of selling their beer. But for those that are owned by pub companies, I simply do not understand this issue about choice. They have more choice in those pub companies from small breweries. They do. They have.
We just heard they can't change their beer prices. They can't compete with a pub across the road that could be selling the same beer at a lower price because they're tied into these contracts. Plus, their rents are going up and they're earning so little. I don't think no one else apart from you seems to be thinking this is a good idea.
Sorry, I don't think even BITS have had. The government has had to admit that their consultation is wrong. They say there have been 400 complaints when there have been 400 inquiries. There are far fewer complaints than this. This is a very well organised campaign, but as far as we are concerned, the vast majority of publicans in this country actually benefit from the Tide system.
Well, it's interesting then. I mean, you seem to be arguing that nothing needs to change, and yet the industry, what needs to happen then?
We have self-regulation. We're on version 6 of the code. There are many things like having a legal and fair, transparent system, which we embrace and are very keen to embrace.
So what's wrong with...
There are real unintended consequences, particularly of breaking the tie. There are some things in the consultation that we can do. The self-evaluation system is evolving. You can complain too. There is a low-cost arbitration scheme, both on rent, so you can complain if your rent is too high. You can complain about anything else that is in the statutory code. It is absolutely legally binding on the companies. But there is a real danger if you get rid of the Tide system that more pubs will close. And at the end of the day, the government's own figures prove that more pubs are closing which are free of tie that are closing that are
Well,
tied.
I think there's disagreement about those
in the high street that are closing. There is no one between an untied licensee and their bank.
Could you
and
just...
We think that banks are going to step in and provide the investment, over £10,000 per pub per year in revenue and £265 million to provide new kitchens.
Okay.
I'm afraid I just don't think that's...
I just want to pick you up on that point that you made about the fact that statutory regulation would accelerate the decline of pubs. Why is that exactly?
Because of this issue about removing the tie. And it's the Tide system. We have a paternalistic... Pub companies are really interested. It is not in their interest that pubs close. If a pub closes or the landlord move on, it costs thousands of pounds for them to replace that landlord and indeed to find somebody else to run the pub. I mean, we've had vast economic problems in this country. We've had a 42% increase in beer taxation, which luckily the Chancellor gave us a small decrease this year, which has been fantastic.
Brigid Simmonds, sorry, we're going to have to...
investment.
Let me bring our guests of the day in. Jeremy Birch, does it matter if pubs shut? We are in a recession after all, changing cultural habits. Should we be trying to keep them open at all costs?
At all costs? I'm not sure about all costs, but I certainly welcome the regulation, and I think the Industry Select Committee has been pressing for this, the Labour Party has been pressing for this. I'm glad the government's at last come to agree that we should have regulation and an adjudicator who can step in, because publicans I know, complain continually in tied houses about the cost of the alcohol they have to buy and the fact they're tied into particular brands and not able to bring in guest beers as they would like to do, and the cost of rents, and it has put a lot of those businesses in a difficult position. And like shops, we do want small businesses to thrive. They're part of our economy as well as being part of our community. So I welcome the regulation coming in.
But Gareth Johnson, the danger is that if the government does bring in statutory regulation, as we heard from Brigid Simmonds, it might not work. In fact, in the past, I understand it hasn't worked at all with more pubs shut.
Well, look, clearly something's got to change. We can't go on with the situation that we have at the moment where pubs are closing at an alarming rate. It does seem to me bizarre that publicans who are in tied arrangements are disadvantaged more than those who are untied. You wouldn't go into a supermarket and expect to only see one brand of crisps, and you shouldn't go into a pub and see only one type of beer on offer. We need to actually get the market forces back into play in our public houses, and that, I believe, actually will stop the number of pubs closing that we've seen of late.
OK, everyone, thanks for now. The fracking company Quadrilla is scheduled to start exploratory drilling in Balkan later this